photograph of my dad on a rail fence near his childhood home in Western New York, circa 1916, with a younger brother. That handsome 4-year-old with the soulful dark eyes is my Uncle John. And that smiling, dimpled, apple-cheeked, chipmunk-cheeked 5-year-old is my dad. There's a story about these boys at that age. A friend of their grandpa in Western New York took them groundhog hunting. He gave them each a big heavy shovel, positioned them over a big hole on either side, and then lit a fire at the other entrance to the groundhog burrow. My dad said, "Don't do that. We could have been mauled by that beast. Fortunately, we stepped back at the critical moment." My Uncle John, alone out of all of my dad's and Uncle John's siblings, all 8 of them, came to visit us where we lived in Philadelphia when I was a child. I was 5 years old, and I had seen pictures of Uncle John with his liquid movie star eyes and his Johnny Mathis wavy hair, and somehow I got it in my head that he was going to look exactly like that famous singer. This was my Johnny Mathis phase. Chances are, your chances are awfully good. What a shock to be shaking hands with an old bald guy, about 40 years old, just a slimmer, younger version of my dad. By the time I was 6, we were traveling to Western New York every summer to spend a week or 2 with all those aunts and uncles, cousins and second cousins, Olean, New York, Jamestown, New York, and Buffalo. Now, Uncle John had never married and had no kids, but he lived in Jamestown just down the street from my dad's closest sister. So picnics, cookouts, trips to the county fair, Uncle John was there, and I got to know him very well. Uncle John was a skilled dressmaker and a chef, sporting tan driving caps, those long, thin, Swisher Sweet cigars, the old-fashioned kind, and seersucker slacks with a sharp crease down the center, in contrast to my dad's coffee-stained, rumpled khaki shorts and canvas boating hat. Uncle John had also been a leader of the Jamestown BPO Elks Club for many, many years. Brotherhood of the Protective Order of Elks, Lodge 263, Exalted Ruler was his official title, but his sisters called him the Exhausted Rooster. I thought because he worked so hard. The first time I heard that, I laughed and laughed. As a young teenager, Uncle John did not seem to find that amusing. When I was 13, Uncle John offered me a dress. He'd make me a dress if I picked out the fabric and the pattern and sent them to him. He took my measurements in August in Jamestown, but by the time I shipped off the fabric and the pattern and he made a dress and shipped it back to me, it was October, and that dress was a full size too small. But I remembered Uncle John. "You girls are slim now." You better lay off your aunt's coconut cake. And I wrote him a thank you letter saying that dress was perfect. When I was in my 40s and my dad in his 80s, my dad started his downward spiral into dementia. The first 3 years were the worst. He was frustrated, furiously angry, and paranoid at his memory loss and his inability to figure out what to do about this mental decline that he was feeling. He also told a lot of very odd stories in this period. He once started a narrative about the mother of my first serious high school boyfriend. These were family friends. My parents had known them for years, and they were political activists, just like my parents. They lived near us and near my dad's bookstore in Philadelphia. And one day, out of the blue, apropos to nothing, my dad said, "I can't remember if I ever had an affair with Rosemary." And then he went on to talk about what a nice person she was, kind and creative, a little eccentric. And then went on to discuss a lot of other people with that same slightly distant, distracted tone that was his general mode of speaking at that time. He also told another story that was more believable about a young man that he and Uncle John knew when they were growing up in Olean. This was an older boy, a white boy, unlike my dad and that whole side of the family that's African American. This boy was the son of a local grain mill owner. And the kids all used to play at the mill. And sometimes this boy would lure the younger kids into the building for sex games. Dad said, "He never got to me. He got John, though." There was this undercurrent of homophobia in that story that shocked me. Maybe even more than those ruminations about romance extramaritally. Those odd stories, those stories about my boyfriend's mother and friends, where he would just go off on these very weird tangents, they really challenged my idealized image about my dad, my sainted father, this warm and affectionate, mischievous trickster of a man, an iconoclast, but an advocate for children and women and oppressed peoples all over the world in his work in the community and with state and national organizations. That story, I didn't know what to make of it, fact or fiction. My dad I never heard him tell a homophobic joke. I never heard him talk about same-sex relationships with the usual colloquial derogatory words or make any negative reference to gay people. But in that period of time when he was so paranoid and so angry and so quick to blow up, he was telling me about a huge argument, this big conflict he was having with this very old and dear friend who'd been a collaborator for years and years with him. They had done a lot of projects together, they'd written magazine articles together, even started a book together. But now he was saying that this very strong, well-respected gay woman had stabbed him in the back, that she lied, that she was turning people against him, that she had taken credit for work that he did, that she just could not be trusted. And he was cutting her out of his life. And then a non sequitur and a wave of his hand, he said, she's a lesbian. And that's when I knew that my dad had lost a piece of his mind. He'd lost a piece of himself. Every summer, even as an adult, when I was grown up, we would take my parents' van, old Dodge van, and drive from Philadelphia up to Olean and Jamestown, wherever the family reunion was. Our week-long visits had turned into a huge family reunion with 100 to 150 people gathering each summer. And one summer during that period, instead of letting the aunts or my dad's older cousins organize this huge event, my favorite cousin and I, Lynn, decided it was time for the younger generation to step up. And we were going to organize the reunion the following year. Well, Lynn's mother, my aunt, you live in Hagerstown, and you live in Connecticut. You know the reunion next year is in Olean. You girls are out of your minds. But we did. It worked. We were successful. Everybody told us it was a wonderful reunion. But on the way up there, from Philadelphia to Olean in the old Dodge van, my dad suddenly came out of his fog and realized that we were on our way to the old home place. We were on our way to the family reunion. And he wanted to know who was organizing it this year, and who was the main speaker going to be, and who had been on the committee, and who was sitting at the head table. Well, there was no head table. There were never any speakers. There was a picnic, and then a banquet in the evening. Sometimes there was a dance, but not nearly as formal as he was making it out. The committee was me and Lynn, and we certainly didn't call ourselves a committee. But he pressed and he wanted to know, and I kept reminding him, you remember I told you it's Cousin Lynn and me, we're doing it this year. I told you about it. He exploded like a powder keg. He was the patriarch of this family. How could they run this show without him? This was unconscionable. He would have to start writing his speech right now. And why had he never been called? Well, who were the other speakers going to be, and why hadn't he been the one to invite them? This went on for about 30 minutes in the car. I felt terrible. I felt as if I had hidden something from him because I hadn't included him in everything. I didn't think he cared. I knew he would forget, and I really didn't think he wanted to know. He was livid. He finally wore himself out in the front seat, passenger seat, and fell asleep. And I hoped that would be it. But the next evening, sitting at the banquet, he remembered. And this time, unfortunately, I was sitting right across the table from him. A table of 8 round tables were all we had in this big hall. Uncle John was sitting with us at the table, and my dad was going on and on and on, and his voice was getting louder and louder. And I wondered what everybody else decline, and he had dementia, but I didn't know how much they knew. And I knew they'd be upset. I kept looking over to see who was watching. After 15 minutes or so, I was in tears and almost sobbing. And I reached over to Uncle John, who was sitting next to my dad, and said, Uncle John, can you explain to him that I did not do any of this intentionally? There was no intention to cut him out of anything. And my dad's head whipped around to Uncle John. Uncle John opened his mouth to speak, and my dad yelled, "Who the hell are you to say?" And I cringed because I thought he was going to say, "You faggot." I froze, and then he stopped. He was still mad as hell, and he was throwing his silverware around, and his food was spread everywhere. He was so angry, but he stopped himself. And I got up from the table and went to the ladies' room to see if I could collect and recompose myself. Eventually, my Uncle Paul, the youngest in the family, and everybody's favorite brother, favorite uncle, came over to find out what was going on, and he took my dad away from the table, and I could see them talking. And when my dad came back to the table after I'd come out of the bathroom, he sat down and said nothing for a while, but eventually, without meeting my eyes, he said that conversation. Uncle John was in a veterans home in Batavia, New York in the middle 90s, dying of cancer. And I visited him there 3 summers in a row. On the bulletin board in his room were all of these cartoon drawings. It was filled with drawings that the young children of my cousins brought him when they visited him every single week. At the funeral, after he died, my favorite cousin, Lynn, her 20-year-old daughter, stood up and gave a eulogy for Uncle John that had everybody in tears. Observing those relationships of these young family members to this man, rethink what I knew about him. It made me see him in a whole different way. It made me realize that my dad, me, meant that I had a very limited vocabulary, language with my Uncle John, because my dad's relationship, my dad's affection for him was so constrained, restrained. More than any of my other aunts and uncles, Uncle John showed me how important my dad's influence was in my life in facilitating or changing, influencing my relationships, my connections with my huge, enormous, and diverse family. Thank you.